Perfect parenting is abusive. It doesn't make room for the child's development. I thought of art as a rebellion, rebelled against the status quo, things as they are. And I still think that.
Were you able to support yourself from the very beginning?
Some people think of MFA as a kind of a finishing school and getting you ready for your career. And I think that's kind of a waste of time.
Especially those students struggling in the bigger cities, right?
Right, it's so bloody expensive.
You can never be prepared until you start doing it.
Just make the coolest, best, most wonderful, most rad work you possibly can.
记得在读本科的时候，偶然在杂志上看见一个艺术家的画，用最严肃的语气讲了一个个笑话。他声情并茂地告诉我，抽象表现主义晚年的德库宁如何与迪士尼喜结连理。大概8年后，我走进了当初我曾看见那批画被构思创作出来的地方。英文中可能有许多高级的词汇，但作为一个中国人，我用小草来形容他的绘画，因为在我看来，他绘画里的功夫并非浮于表面的形态堆叠，而是一种将不同笔触、不同宗的图像符号翻炒在一起的丰富口感滋味。正如他的身份有很多，一个曾获得古根海姆奖、罗马奖，作品被众多机构收藏的艺术家，一个从90年代开始便以艺术评论编织出独立于传统的当代艺术视角的艺评人，一个任教于哥伦比亚大学带硕士研究生的导师。跟随他的身份，我们的谈话也就此一步步展开。从他如何在一个人人追逐5分钟成名机会的时代，耐着性子确立属于他绘画的价值，到他关于艺术院校研究生教育的洞见，以及在他长久策展人及导师身份里所总结出对于今日年轻艺术家可行的发展路径。
So firstly, I noticed that there are a lot of humor in your work. I myself also include a lot of humor in my work, but my humor, I think they're mostly from a kind of fear. It's the camouflage of my anger.
That's interesting. I like that. So I guess there's two. I'm kind of thinking of it in a couple different ways. That idea of the camouflaging anger is a little bit deeper than my first answer, which has to do with humor as a kind of upending of expectations. You create an expectation and then you do something different, and it causes a sort of shock that results in a kind of surprise. So for me, if there's humor, if it's funny, that's almost a byproduct to this idea of playing with expectations. So I feel like one of the most important things that art can do is help us to see things slightly differently than the usual way of looking at things, the habitual or the everyday. And so if you can kind of create an expectation, something familiar, and then render it unfamiliar, that sometimes results in humor, and sometimes it results in disorientation. But then, of course, underneath that, what drives us, what makes us really go? I know when I was a younger artist, anger was part of it. I was just shocked at the world as I found it. It seemed very stupid. It seemed very oppressive. It seemed unfair. And so I thought of art as a rebellion, rebelled against the status quo, things as they are. And I still think that. It's a rebellion that's in consciousness, in your mind, in your feelings.
When I came in earlier, I said the word vagueness. I think it's mesmerizing because I myself or the other artists I've been working with before, they're just not able to deliver that kind of imagery in works. So how do you come up with the composition, and how do you just, let's call it stir frying? They're just images, motifs from different dimensions, right?
Right.
But you're kind of just render them together. So I guess in English, the only word I can find is render, but I think you are kind of just stir frying everything together.
I love stir fry. That's a wonderful metaphor for my method. I really care about the thing that excites me almost more than anything is this process of assembling an image and assembling it from a variety of sources, from intuitions. Sometimes in the drawing process, the preparation, I'll be looking for protagonists, the main characters, I'll be looking at locations, and then I'll be kind of taking them apart and weaving them back together. And so that is a kind of a mixing, it's a stir fry, but what I often like to do is to not then crunch them into one single coherent fiction, but to keep them a little bit disorganized, or that maybe even, parts of the painting will be spoken in a different language, and that these languages coexist. Let's call them, modes of representation or schema, something like that. So you might have a cartoony thing that butts up against something very abstract. And so hopefully I can capture in that something about thinking, the way thinking happens. We think in language often, and language is made up of things we've heard and remember and fragments that we assemble into new sentences. And I think that making a painting can be a little bit like that.
You mentioned that you were really anxious about the status of falling behind.
Oh, in art school, yes.
Yeah. Do you think artists should pay attention to what other artists do? Because I always think so. Like, we should keep an eye on the world happening around us. But while I was in my MFA program, I was in several critiques. The person presenting their work, they said they didn't care about what others are make or art history at all.
I mean, that can be a kind of working fiction, I'll call it. Like, yeah, you made this as if you're all by yourself in your own little cuckoo world, and that's not actually true. But you believe it, and maybe your belief in it makes some cool work. But we don't have to believe you. Because in fact, your language, everything you're doing in these paintings or these artworks is connected to the whole history and the language. You're like you're kind of, you emerge within language, within a culture. The very fact that you're deciding to make an artwork and you're calling it an artwork puts you in history, puts you in a historic context. And you might deny it, you might pretend you're not there. But that pretending is actually part of the history.
You can't really stay away from the contemporaneous. So early on, you were influenced by Cubism?
I was.
Like how the constructions of the image?
Yeah, in some ways, weirdly, my undergraduate education was recapitulating modern art.
That was in the 70s?
In the 70s, yeah, the mid-late 70s. So I went to the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. Of course, I wanted to do sculpture right away, and I had to do foundation, learn how to draw and paint. And one of my teachers had us going outside and draw and painting from observation, like the Impressionists. And so then I kind of fell in love with Cézanne. He was a god in terms of this relationship between perception, consciousness, and making. And so I kind of followed that, and that opened up into Cubism and Picasso and all the rest, abstraction. So that history of modern art kind of made sense to me within my own process of making and trying to be an artist.
Were you able to support yourself from the very beginning?
Yeah, I was a house painter, and I mean, I kind of didn't really expect to make a living from art. It seemed like more like a vice, like a drug addiction. You
just enjoy making it.
Yeah, so you make money in order to do this thing and participate in a kind of parallel culture. And then it's, I got a grant and started to sell works, and then did teaching. So I've always kind of supplemented it, and my family helped me out a little bit, and whatever. We all, you sort of make it work.
Do you think it's still the same for younger emerging artists?
Today?
Now? Yeah.
It's a lot harder.
I guess so.
It's a lot harder. Because then, when I moved to New York in the late 70s. I was still a student. I studied at the New York Studio School, and real estate was worthless. So you could have a studio like this for, under $100 a month. So that means you could do house painting for like 2 or 3 days a week, and like that was enough. But now you have to have 3 jobs.
Yeah.
So it's harder. And I think the art world has become way more professionalized. Like back then it was a little scrappier, and you could make a show. You could just take over a space. It was abandoned, make a show, it'd be really cool. Somebody brings alcohol
and then it's a party.
Yeah,
it's the opening.
Party. You make a party.
But nowadays it's just so different.
It's so different, but you can still do that. And I think in a way, it still sort of works that way. Artists organize themselves, they make things happen. Young galleries show them, something happens, the mid-range galleries notice, like, ooh, this is a scene, this is cool, I'm gonna show that artist, and then the mega galleries eventually scoop them up. I mean, the mega galleries don't discover artists. They shepherd a career that's already going. I don't know. That's my short version of how the art world works.
Do you talk about it with your students?
I make jokes about it. They're in art school, they're committed, they're all in, and I love that. And so I'm part of that ambition. But if they ask me that question, I will not be unrealistic. And they understand. But I don't give them career advice. I like to think about their work, the history that surrounds it, the culture that we're living in under which it's being made. Focus on that, they'll figure out the career stuff.
So you're just not worried about them?
No. I mean, I worry about them, I care about them, but there's nothing I can do to get them up and running. And I kind of prefer, some people think of MFA as a kind of a finishing school and getting you ready for your career. And I think that's kind of oftentimes a waste of time. Like all that career preparation doesn't actually get you the thing you want.
You can never be prepared until you start doing it.
Just make the coolest, best, most wonderful, most rad work you possibly can, and then you'll figure out how to
That's very
get
true.
it out there.
Especially those students struggling in the bigger cities, right?
Right, it's so bloody expensive, and then you've got your tuition. I think there's something really wrong, really broken. It's both heartbreaking and infuriating.
Do you think you are conscious about your different role, like as teacher, as educator, as curator, as artist? Do you have a ranking, or you just throw them together?
That's interesting. No, I throw them together. I mean, I feel like I'm an artist primarily, and so that everything kind of rolls out from that. So
you are
as
the
a teacher, I teach from the position of being an artist. I mean, I'll read theory and criticism and, literature as a way to kind of thicken my language, the language with which I talk about art. And so that's kind of, teaching, that's sort of teaching oriented, but I think it also helps making work. I think if you have a sense of how the language you use is situated culturally now, or how it kind of has evolved historically, that gives it a kind of, gives it power and depth and just more interesting. But it's not necessary. There's some people who just don't worry their heads about it at all. They just make the thing and whatever it is. Make a cool painting. What does it mean to make a cool painting? Well, that's the complex part. They don't need to take it apart and see what, that this thing, the cool painting, is actually very complex.
I'm just really curious because for myself, I always overthink about things. Do you overthinking at all? Because your body of works, I can feel the urgency of making.
Right.
And it seems that it's not a problem for you at all.
That's huge, I think. Like if overthinking leads to paralysis, like suddenly, like just like I don't know what to do now, then it's not good overthinking. I mean, I love it when I just have an instinct and an intuition. I mean, I usually kind of know loosely what I'm doing, and some paintings are completely planned, but there's always some spontaneous feature to it, which I'm finding it again, or there's things that I'm not sure about, or what's it going to look like really big, or like, will those people be in it, or should it be a table? And that kind of uncertainty, to me, helps the work become more than what I planned. I mean, and I guess I have this idea maybe of like the good enough idea. It's a little bit based on, I don't know if you know this guy, D.W. Winnicott. He was a psychoanalyst and had the idea of good enough mothering, good enough parenting is actually better than really good perfect parenting. Perfect parenting is abusive because it doesn't make room for the child's development. The child's development needs some shortcomings, needs the parent to be a little bit flawed. And I feel like with an idea, you can have a really great idea and the painting will never live up to it. It will always fall short, whereas a good enough idea means that the painting might actually be bigger than you and the idea. Should I look in the camera?
Yeah. Okay.
You ready? Art is the attitude.